welcome back to my channel. If you enjoy ghost stories or the paranormal, then you have come to the right place. So sit back, put on some headphones, and enjoy. Today's story is titled The Throwing Ghost of SLAWENSIK Castle. And I have to say, before I even start the story, I'm sure you can see the candle. A lot of times when I'm telling a story, the candle just has a tendency to flicker on its own. I always find that quite interesting. So let's start with our story. On October 28, 1806, after Napoleon and the French army mauled Prussian armies at the Battle of Jena, Prince Friedrich Hohenlohe-Ingelfingen, 1746 to 1818, was declared a prisoner of war and taken to France. He was held captive, his future unclear, as Napoleon decided whether to use him as a political pawn, ransom him, or set him free. One of the most trusted members of Friedrich's council, August Haun, had also been taken prisoner, but having won the parole from the French, prepared to return to his homeland. The prince asked Haun to oversee his castle at SLAWENSIK in Upper Silesia, today one of the most industrialized regions of Poland, until Napoleon saw fit to release him. Although he was eager to return to his own home, Haun's admiration for the prince demanded that he accept the responsibility. Haun would have the company of his personal servant, Johann, two of the prince's coachmen, and Frau Knittel, the caregiver who lived on the grounds with her son. However, in addition to the company of servants, I must relight my candle. One moment. That's better. Let's continue. I told you there always an issue with the candles. So let's see, where were we? However, in addition to the company of servants, Haun wanted to ensure the presence of intellectual fellowship as well. He entreated his boyhood friend, Karl Kern, who had also been at the Battle of Jena, to join him at the castle until they might return home. Kern consented to become a member of the group that would oversee their prince's empty home. The entourage arrived at SLAWENSIK Castle on November 19th, 1806. It was about 9 o'clock on the third evening after their arrival, when Haun and Kern were pelted by a shower of limestone and other debris as they sat reading in the corner room they occupied on the first floor. In those times, lime was commonly used as an ingredient in plaster, mortar, and cement, and so believing the old castle ceiling was crumbling, Kern jumped to his feet, cursing the medieval structure for beginning to collapse around them. Han glanced warily toward the ceiling. There were no cracks in the ceiling. How could lime and debris fall on them from the ceiling if there was no hole from which they might drop? The two friends stood up on chairs so they might have a better inspection of the ceiling. They were unable to detect one single sign of damage. But as they reached the area above them and searched, lime once again began to rain down. Kern picked up a number of pieces from the fresh fall and commented that they felt very cold to the touch, as if they had come from an outside wall. Han continued to study the ceiling for some time for some kind of opening through which the lime might have dropped. In the morning, he said, they would have to put the servants to work at repairs before the winter got any worse. When the men awakened the next morning, they were greatly disturbed to find the room carpeted by the mysterious lime. Kern groused the ceiling could have fallen in on them while they slept, but Han was quick to point out that there seemed to be no gaping cracks in the walls or ceiling that would have caused so much lime to fall. On the fourth night of their stay in the castle, the bits of lime did more than fall from an apparently invisible crack. Large fragments began to fly about the room and pelt the two men. As they retreated to their bedrooms, hoping for safety, the sound of loud knockings began to reverberate down the ancient halls of the castle. Kern was convinced that Han was trying to frighten him and was somehow responsible for the occurrences. But while both of Han's hands were in full view of his nervous and angry companion, a loud series of knocks shook the room. Since the loud raps on the wall made sleep virtually impossible, Han began to record the unexplained phenomena in his journal. An attorney, Han was not a man who could be easily deceived or taken in by the work of a prankster. When the manifestations began on the fifth night, Han and Kern were ready to investigate the rooms overhead. While Han remained below, Kern and the son of the castle's caretaker went to search the apartments above their rooms. All the rooms were empty. Later that night, Kern and Han were awakened by the sound of what sounded like slippered feet moving across their room. They lit a candle and confirmed that they were the only individuals in the room. Before the end of the evening, the invisible slippers were joined by what sounded like a walking stick bouncing on one end. By the next evening, the inhabitants of the castle had conducted an exhaustive search of all the possible natural causes for the disturbances. As the activity began to intensify, it became very apparent that there was a supernatural cause for the commotion. Candlesticks flew from one corner of a room to another. When the household sat down to dinner, knives, forks, plates, and foodstuffs became animated and airborne. Anything movable seemed to be possessed and have the ability to levitate about the room. After 3 weeks of enduring sleepless nights, Han and Kern ordered the servants to move their things into the corner room overhead, where the sounds had initially seemed to originate. Han had not slept long when he was awakened by the sound of his friend whimpering. Han rolled out of bed and saw Kern staring into a mirror as though he were transfixed. He was extremely pale and trembling, as if suffering from a high fever. After taking several moments to compose himself, Kern managed at last to say that while looking in the mirror, he had seen clearly reflected a feminine figure all swathed in white. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but he could see his own reflection behind the ghostly woman. When the phantasm's eyes had met his own, Kern perceived the face to be that of an old woman. Her features appeared quite tranquil and not at all disagreeable, but he could not help being filled with some sort of nameless dread. Han stepped to the mirror and demanded that the shape show itself to him. He stared into the mirror for 15 minutes before he finally abandoned his attempts to summon the ghost of the woman. The following dawn, as soon as they heard the servants stirring, Han said that they might just as well have their things brought back down to the first floor. After Han and Kern had spent a month at SLAWENSIK castle, their weird tales of unearthly happenings began to spread abroad. 2 Bavarian officers, Captain Cornet and Lieutenant Nagel, both hard-nosed skeptics, decided to visit the castle and see what all the ghost business was about. Nagel, the most vocal in his skepticism, offered to spend a night in the haunted corner room where Kern had seen the ghostly figure of the old woman. The men had not left the Bavarian officer alone for more than a few minutes when they heard the lieutenant cursing loudly. The usual noises of the disturbance were punctuated by the sounds of the officer's saber hacking away at table and chairs. When they opened the door to the room, they were shocked to see Nagel chopping at the air with his saber. It was difficult to believe that the officer who moments before displayed such cynicism and bravery had been reduced to a frightened man who ran about an empty room, slashing at an invisible enemy. At the sight of his companions entering the bedroom, Nagel seemed to shake off his fear and replace it with anger. As soon as the others had left him alone, he explained, the accursed thing had begun to pelt him with invisible objects. He had looked everywhere but could see nothing. His anger had gotten the best of him, and he had drawn his saber. Once again in control of his faculties, the lieutenant began to suggest that he might somehow have been tricked by Han and Kern. The two friends sat down with the officers and earnestly sought to convince them that they were not guilty of any connivance. Cornet had assured his fellow officer that he had not allowed Han and Kern out of his sight. Then, while the four men sat talking around the table, candlesticks rose in mid-air and fell to the floor. A lead ball struck Han on the chest, but did not harm him. The sound of footsteps began to pad about the room, and a drinking glass jumped off a stand and shattered against the floor. Although the Bavarian officers protested that such things were impossible, neither of them accused Han or Kern of being responsible for the manifestations. The phenomena at SLAWENSIK Castle continued to increase in strength and ingenuity. Once, after Han had carefully prepared some water for shaving and had heated it just the temperature that he desired, the warm water was sucked out of the basin and disappeared before he was able to moisten his razor. Herr Dorfel, a local bookseller, had his hat hidden from him as he was preparing to leave the castle. After the household had looked for several minutes in vain, Dorfel's hat was seen floating teasingly in front of its owner. As the frustrated and frightened bookseller reached for his headpiece, it jerked out of his grasp. With Dorfel running in pursuit, the hat led its owner on a merry chase before it finally dropped to its feet. Han, who had exhausted from months of sleep deprivation, firmly announced to the ghost one night that he did not want to have a single object thrown at him while he attempted to rest on his bed. It seemed for a little while as though the entity was going to cooperate with him. Han had just drifted off into a deep sleep when he was rudely awakened by a large quantity of water being dumped on his face. Perhaps the strangest phenomenon occurred while Han was absent. Having left the castle to journey to the nearby city of Breslau, the months of disturbances had left Kern too nervous to endure a night alone in his bedroom. And so he persuaded Johann, Han's personal servant, to spend the night with him. They had not been settled long before they saw a jug of beer rise slowly from a table and begin to pour its beverage into a tumbler. Then, before their unbelieving eyes, the glass was lifted and began to empty, just as if someone were drinking from it. As the glass was put back on the table, the men went to the spot where the invisible being had just drunk the entire tumbler of beer. There was not a drop of beer to be found on the floor. The men were terrified that the invisible thing could actually swallow liquid. Nights later, as Han returned to the castle, he began to hear the sound of a dog following closely behind him. Thinking it was his greyhound, Flora, the attorney turned and called the dog by name. There was nothing to be seen. Han continued walking, still hearing what he believed to be a dog walking closely behind him. Even when he ascended the stairs leading to the front door of the castle, he could still hear the dog panting at his heels. Kern met him at the door, holding it open for a prolonged period of time after Han had passed through into the castle. Han promptly asked if he had seen a dog walking behind him up the stairs. Kern answered that of course he had. He had seen Flora behind him, and that had been the reason that he had taken hold of the door to hold it open after Han had already passed into the castle. He was afraid that Han seemed not to see her, and he was concerned that he might shut the door on her. Han explained to Kern about the mysterious footfalls of the invisible dog that had been following him in the dark, and the two friends immediately began a search for the greyhound. If one of them had heard a dog and the other had seen one, surely Flora must now be scampering about in the woods. They found Flora locked up in the stables. The coachman assured them that the dog had not been set free any time during the day. After the strange incident, the manifestations at SLAWENSIK came to a halt. Han remained at the old castle for another 6 months until Prince Hohenlohe was released from imprisonment in France. Han concluded his journal on November 19th, 1808, 2 years to the day that they had first arrived at SLAWENSIK Castle, with the words, "I have described these events exactly as I heard and saw them from beginning to end. I observed them with the most entire self-possession. Yet the whole thing remains to me perfectly inexplicable." Han did not seek to publish his bizarre journal until 20 years had passed. At that time, he submitted the manuscript to Dr. Andrew Justinus Kerner, the lyric poet, physician, chemist, and pioneer cyclical researcher. When Kerner published the journal, it created an immediate sensation in Germany. In 1830, SLAWENSIK was destroyed by a fire caused by the direct strike of a lightning bolt. In the ruins, workmen discovered the skeleton of a man who had been walled up in a secret enclosure. His skull had been split, and a sword lay by his side. To many, this discovery was a possible explanation for all the disturbances that had plagued the castle. I hope you enjoyed today's story, a little poltergeist activity. And if you do like stories such as this, comment below, or you can also email me. My email is in the description box. Tell me your story and I will read it in one of my future videos. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell. I do upload several times a week. And if you have any suggestions, please let me know. Until then, stay a little bit scared. Bye.